So I find this podcast process incredibly difficult. I'm uncomfortable. I don't think I'm very good at it. People who have listened to our previous podcast express just how boring, how unfunny I am. And I think I'm a funny guy. I think people think, yeah, Frank, he's a funny guy. I mean, he's not the guy who's going to probably win the Nobel Peace Prize, but he's funny. And on the podcast,
you just clam up.
I clam up and I'm very, very rigid. And it's like stiff.
Oh, it's stiff. Oh.
No.
Tell me more.
And this is why I'm uncomfortable, because you are not. And you say things like that.
Yeah.
And then I don't know what to say next. Do you see what she did? I talk about being stiff. I'm bearing my soul about how difficult this is for me. And you took it and you went right to...
Let's talk about sex, baby.
And I know where you're going with this. The reason we're having this intro right now...
Because you sent me like 5 links to the Screen Cream. It started because you said you were watching the basketball and every other ad was for men's sexual health.
Every ad in the NCAA tournament is for erectile dysfunction. I'm like, what's the women's equivalent? And it turns out there isn't one in the traditional form, but it's the same medicine.
Yeah, and we talked about this at Women of Wonder in Fiji.
And
one of our guests had what she was calling Screen Cream. Yeah, anyway, whatever.
Anyway, this is not the direction we're going in.
Unless we want My Alloy Health to be a sponsor.
You know what they'll do? They'll say, oh my God, we would love to be a sponsor, but Frank's not funny.
But you are adjacent, dear.
I am adjacent. I do consider myself
self-proclaimed
adjacent. It's understanding what happens in midlife to women and being a partner in that process. And I think I'm pretty damn evolved.
You are.
Yeah.
I'm impressed with you.
We had our salon last Saturday, CULTISH, by best-selling New York Times author Amanda Montell. It was really cool.
And she is adorable.
But you can't say adorable. Like, I can't say adorable. See, this is, okay, her book is The Language of Fanaticism, CULTISH. We'll get into that later. But I can't say adorable. She's 5 feet something, and she's very pretty. And if I say any of those things, if I say, oh, she's adorable, that's disingenuous. It's saying...
It seems demeaning. It seems too juvenile
she's
for...
a New York Times best-selling author.
I get it.
She's an absolute kick-ass professional.
She is witty and sharp. Yes.
So I can't call her adorable.
Yeah.
You can call her adorable.
We had fun with her. She's a cool chick. Now we're on to her other book, The Age of Magical
Overthinking. And this is also a really great read. So
this is her current bestseller on New York Times.
And then she's going to be writing some fiction. Anyway, all of that is in the interview that Jessica and Amanda had at our last salon in San Francisco.
It was at the amazing home studio of Sylvia Piloto in San Francisco. She generously lent her space out to us, and we had 20 of us sitting around listening to her philosophy behind language, as you'll hear, and everyone came with questions.
A very spirited conversation followed.
Yeah.
So,
including quite a heartfelt, endearing dinner. We had a great dinner catered by one of our favorite caterers in the Bay Area, Hugh Groman Catering. Boy, we had some old Woodsiders out there that got a little sappy.
Well, I think we've been around for a long time, and we're still hanging out together, and I think that's
a testimony to our community and our friendship, our own little cult.
I think non-Woodsiders probably find it very annoying, but also endearing, maybe even adorable.
Our adorable little town.
I think you can call a town adorable. I do.
Yeah.
You know, I think you can call a baby adorable. I think you can call a best-selling New York Times author accomplished, right? But not adorable.
I get you.
So Amanda, if you're listening, you are not adorable.
I might still call you that.
Yeah. All right.
Anyway, it's a term of endearment.
Amanda is a writer, linguist, and podcast host whose work exposes the power of language in shaping culture and belief systems. She's the author of CULTISH, The Language of Fanaticism and Word Slut, a feminist guide to taking back the English language. She also co-hosts the podcast Sounds Like a Cult, which we listen to for hours on our way up from LA. And this is where she dissects modern groups that toe the line between community and cult. And Amanda's latest book, The Age of Magical Overthinking, is a New York Times bestseller. So congratulations on that.
Amanda, What first drew you into the intersection of linguistics and cult psychology? Was there a specific moment or experience that made you realize the power of language shaping belief systems?
There really was. So growing up, I was on sort of high alert for cultish dynamics, mostly because of my dad. My dad spent his teenage years in Synanon against his will. Some folks, especially in this part of the country, probably have heard of it, but it was an alternative drug rehabilitation center in the 60s and 70s and then early 80s turned, dogmatic, hypocritical, abusive, socialist utopian compound, typical stuff. And he was sort of coerced to join when he was a young teenager and got out when he was 17. So I grew up in his household, and my parents are also research scientists. So I came of age with a healthy dose of skepticism.
Yeah.
And, I was conditioned in the cult of scientific inquiry.
Yeah.
I don't know. But that is not to say that I have not fallen victim to my fair share of cultish influence. It's just not always shown up in the environments that I was trained to be on high alert for. But yeah, as I got older, I couldn't help but notice that the cultish dynamics that my dad would describe in his Synanon stories, the sort of us versus them dynamics and worship of one charismatic leader and, the ends justify the means philosophy
exactly.
and such could be found in groups that we might not all agree were full-blown cults, but could at the very least agree were cult-ish, like my high school theater program and, the startup where I worked in my early 20s, and certainly the ways in which people would interact on social media, Instagram. And from a young age, I was always really interested in language. That was just like the lens through which I perceived the world. I was always really interested in what I would later learn was the field of sociolinguistics, so where the science of language and social sciences and sociology intersect. So the relationship between like language, power, identity, and I explored those topics through the lens of gender in my first book. But there was one moment that made me realize that I wanted to sort of more formally explore the language of cults in that book, Cultish. And it was when I was 26, I think. And my best friend was about to get married to someone who she would promptly divorce. And we were standing in a graveyard in Seattle, Washington, smoking a cigarette. Don't tell my parents. She had just gotten sober and was going to AA meetings. And, I knew a little bit about the language I knew about how Synanon oriented itself around sobriety language, which was very distinct and could be problematic at times. In Synanon, they called addicts dope fiends, and they called people who joined Synanon just because they wanted in on this sort of alternative way of life, lifestylers. And there were so many other specialized terminology that I grew up hearing from my dad's stories. But my friend was in AA, which was like a mainstream group that was having like this definitely like net positive effect on her life. But the specialized buzzwords and little mantras and turns of phrase and acronyms that she was using sort of tingled my spidey senses and made me feel like this reminds me in a sense.
Yeah.
It's not identical, but it reminds me in a sense of that Synanon language. She was using acronyms like, which stands for hungry, angry, lonely, and tired, but like turned into a verb as like a sort of justification why you might be, like behaving in a way that you couldn't really justify. Or, she had this really interesting like semantic and grammatical turn of phrase where she would say like that someone was behaving in such a way because they had caught a resentment. And I was like, that is such a peculiar turn of phrase. It's AA language. And, the big book in AA culture has such this like robust roster of vocabulary. And this friend of mine was also kind of like interested in the true crime genre and has a kind of macabre sense of humor, as I can tell that you and many of these people in the room here do, where we can kind of like toe that line of making a joke about something dark, but we know when we're being serious, but we also know when we're kidding. And
but in the AA reference too, it's also like you've come from one addiction to then using language of devotion.
That's right.
So which is very interesting.
There was something devotional.
You say that like certain words and phrases can be hypnotic.
Yeah. Yeah. So I knew in that moment in that graveyard with her, I was like, I want to write about the language of cults, but not cults just like Jonestown, also cults like AA or maybe SoulCycle, no shade. And I was like, where, what is, how does this wide spectrum of groups use language for better and for worse? Because being in a hypnotic or even like narcotic state for a period of time isn't inherently bad, you know, like engaging in certain levels of mysticism seems like inherently human. It happens all the time. Like it's a way that
Like there's collective effervescence, but then it goes to the next level.
Yeah. And I could easily see how one could weaponize it. I'm just kidding. No, yes. I'm kidding. Let's do it tonight. I'm just kidding. But yeah, so I, you know, thought of this idea like this language is surreptitiously a cultish leader's most powerful tool of influence, even though it's invisible and seemingly commitment free. But how does that really manifest? And I started looking into this topic from so many different angles. There was the neuroscience angle. So I came across certain studies that had found that religious or spiritual chanting, say like in a Buddhist environment, had this de-stressing effect where, you know, it lowered people's cortisol and it elevated people's serotonin and dopamine. It had like all these chemical effects on people that put them in a bonding state. Talk to the only linguist in the world who studies glossolalia or speaking in tongues. This really interesting guy who came to that field of study in a really circuitous way, but he was talking to me about how like when one speaks in tongues, later. But when one speaks in tongues, they enter a dissociative state, not like necessarily a clinically dissociative state, but a sort of heightened level of dissociation that's not that different from the dissociation that we all experience when we get lost in thought and realize we've missed our exit, even though we've taken that route 1,000 times. So it puts you in a state of dissociation that's, you know, kind of like that, but maybe X 100. Don't quote me on the numbers. And that state, especially when you're being guided by a religious figure who has some stake in your money and in your loyalty, it can make you suggestive and it can make you vulnerable to certain types of influence. It can prime you for what is called like a conversion event where.
And have you seen there's have you seen a linguistic thread between all these kind of types of cultish organizations?
Yeah, there is definitely a thread. I mean, whether you're just using like some fun, cozy, insidery acronyms or something much more sinister, and I think we'll probably get to this topic later, but a cult linguistic technique called the thought terminating cliche. No matter if you're using something that's fully cultish in a nefarious capacity or cultish in a cozier way, it serves the purpose of like rallying people behind a collective mission, establishing an us versus them dynamic, which isn't always bad, you know, like we are primed for community building and a little bit of tribalism for survival purposes and just like life enjoyment purposes too. It's important for solidarity, but when too many of these cult linguistic techniques that I've kind of identified and put forth as like the qualities of this dialect that I'm calling cultish, like English or Spanish or Swedish, but cultish. When too many of these are kind of working in tandem, it can be a clue that we're entering territory that's a little too cultish for comfort, you might say.
So there some phrases that seem harmless, like everything happens for a reason or trust the process, subtly nudge people in a certain direction.
They can, yeah. So those are sort of everyday examples of this cult linguistic technique that I came across called the thought terminating cliche, which was coined by a psychiatrist in 1961 named Robert J. Lifton. And it describes a sort of stock expression that's easily memorized, easily repeated, and aimed at shutting down independent thinking or questioning. And you know, I'm sure we can all think of one or two. And, you know, a cult leader can't have influence without this linguistic technique, but we're not always on guard for it because it's work to have to think. It takes a great deal of effort to have to work through cognitive dissonance, that like uncomfortable discord that you might feel when you're like, oh my God, I've like dedicated 20 years of my life to this group, but none of the promises that were made have ended up becoming true. Here's like a zingy stock expression that someone can serve me when I express some pushback to sort of put that cognitive dissonance to bed and allow them to remain in more power for a little longer. So like, yeah, an everyday example would be like, it is what it is, you know, like boys will be boys, that kind of thing. But then in a cultish scenario, like, I don't know, in QAnon, for example, thought terminating cliches might sound like dismissing valid concerns about COVID-19 5 years ago, let's say, or even now, with the phrase, you know, don't let yourself be ruled by fear, or, you know, you need to do your research.
So that, and then there's also the jargon of that creates an aura of exclusivity and authority.
Yeah.
So explain that a bit, like give an example of a group or movement.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, an example we can probably all relate to, or most of us at least, is like, who remembers learning Pig Latin on the playground as a kid?
Exactly.
Like, you're not saying anything in Pig Latin that can't be said in plain English, but it instantly makes you feel cooler than everyone else who doesn't know it.
Yeah.
And so I find that in some cultish corporate environments, you mentioned, corporations that suggest that your coworkers are a family. I found that there's some, really conformist corporate jargon that feels really good to learn when you show up and get this job that you've worked really hard for. It makes you feel like you're a part of the in-group, like you're, zipping yourself into a snazzy new linguistic uniform. Like I remember, my day job for quite a while before I started writing this kind of stuff was I worked at a beauty magazine, and there was a real sort of cultish, cliquey kind of mean girl vibe there. But I really wanted to be accepted by them, and yet I was kind of disdainful of that feeling as well. So speaking of cognitive dissonance, woof, it was raging when I was there. But I noticed immediately when I got there that they would use certain acronyms and abbreviations that literally did not take less time to say than just like the normal word, but that made everyone feel like they were a part of the in-group, and that not only if you didn't know it, you weren't a part of it, but that if you didn't use it, you might be clocked as a rebel. And that might signal to upper management that you were not appropriate for promotions or things like that, because you might not be the team player, the like sort of conformist team player that they were looking for. And I remember, the one that gave me the heebie-jeebies the most, and this is just subjective, but it would really, send a shiver down my spine when people would turn like nouns into verbs and verbs into nouns, like when a certain initiative like wasn't working, or, when something that they thought was a brilliant idea 3 weeks ago, but then ended up losing them a bunch of money. When they wanted to kind of be like, we're going to kick that to the curb, they would say, we're going to sunset this. And it was so euphemistic and so evocative. And I thought there was something, maybe not Jonestown level, but there was something sinister about that type of terminology.
Sure. And then you've also talked about influencers and celebrities and that cult of personality. What's a phrase, rhetorical trick that immediately makes you think this person is trying to create a following instead of just engaging with their audience?
My God. Well, it is fascinating because there are certain celebrities who are more of like a figurehead for a fan cult that has developed around them as kind of a godlike figure of worship, but they don't really participate. And then there are the celebrities who participate. And this subject matter becomes ever fascinating as the lines separating celebrity, politician, business leader become ever blurred, But yeah, I mean, to use like a somewhat innocuous example, I find that like Taylor Swift will like purposefully insert like Easter eggs and symbols into the language that she uses online to like whip her followers up into a frenzy. And I think it can be a net positive thing, but because of the dynamics of like social media and the lack of sort of like in-person empathy there, sometimes power hierarchies can start to form surrounding like who is the most in the know fan, and then a kind of like conspiratorial attitude can formulate around like what she really meant by that. And it's honestly mostly a harmless thing. I say that, but there have been some fans who have been really like psychologically harmed by some of these dynamics. So
if you're fragile.
If you're fragile, can you handle it? Yeah, but I find that there are some hidden messages that certain celebrities will use at first, maybe for fun, and then maybe sort of conspiratorially. I could see a situation in which some celebrities might take that conspiratorial attitude that they've egged on in their following and use it later.
And it could just kind of get ahead of them. I mean, which came
really
first,
knows?
the chicken or the egg on that one.
Yeah.
And then for Marty, the wellness culture. We see phrases like high vibe foods, manifest your reality, detox your energy. How does this kind of language blur the line between self-improvement and something more cultish?
That's such a good, I mean, we could have just like an hour-long conversation about those terms themselves. Yeah. Well, I think like on the more innocent end, some of this kind of like new agey terminology that combines sort of spiritual rhetoric with science rhetoric can just like signify to other people that you're someone who like likes to work on themselves, and maybe you're willing to experiment in alternative spaces to do that. And that can be, like a totally harmless thing. But these days there is the sort of crunchy to alt-right pipeline, as some have termed it, where, if you are sort of trained with language in certain spaces to believe that, mainstream health authorities can never, ever be trusted. And I certainly have my fair share of skepticism for Big Pharma. I certainly do. But if there are certain figures who use this language to suggest that they're tapped into an authority higher than science, that could send some down a much more nefarious conspiratorial rabbit hole where suddenly they're in more QAnon type territory.
So, and back to, so you kind of got like the cult of Soul Cycle, or the cult of Taylor Swift, and it all comes down to us really starving for community.
Yeah.
That human nature, that they want there's some appeal to these cultish organizations. What is it about the need for human connection? It seems like, and we see it at our certain age group here, where the middle age group goes two ways. You either go into routine, and this is what we do every Tuesday. I play golf with Bob, and every Wednesday I play cards with Sally, and every night I read my book from 8 until 10, and I don't need any more friends. Or then those unhinged empty nesters who are like, I want it all, and I want to meet so many new people, and, I'm at this next level of my life, and blah, blah, blah. So one group is fueled by, I have my little community and I don't need to leave it, or I want to expand my community. What is that human drive that is occurring in our lives right now?
So fascinating. Well, I've spoken to so many people about this particular thing, sort of, Surgeon General endorsed epidemic of loneliness. So I've spoken to psychologists about this. I've spoken to reporters whose beat is like adult friendship about this. Really, it seems to me like human relationships are presented with more complicated barriers and struggles than they ever were in the past. Like, if you even look at 50, 60 years ago, I would not trade my life for my grandmother's life, definitely. Like, I would rather live in a time when I have more rights and more opportunities as a woman, and when information is more democratized and more accessible. Like, I would rather live now. But there are trade-offs, like living in smaller communities where you maybe don't have more or less limitless options for where your life is going to go, and where you're going to move, and what your hair color is going to be, and who your friends are. You have a kind of playbook, and you have like a blueprint for who your friends are going to be. And you probably are going to know those same people for 30, 40, 50 years. And that creates comfort. But of course, with comfort comes a trade-off of like lack of liberation and lack of agency. So with more liberation and more agency comes the lack of comfort and increased loneliness. We're simply living in a time where like, yeah, you can be so many different things, and you can move in so many different places, but like that's going to jeopardize your relationships and feel really unsettling. And meanwhile, anyone who uses social media is potentially comparing their life to a sort of hologram portrayal of nearly infinite lives. Like, that's not a healthy way to triangulate an identity or a community. Like, the ways that we conceive of community are becoming so much more abstract. Like, are the people who follow me on Instagram my community? I don't know. Yeah. Like, are the coworkers who I only know on Slack my community? And like, what is our social currency now? And so those things have just become so much more complicated and overwhelming for like a human brain that was oriented to know like 100 people its whole life. Yeah. And so I think one of the ways in which we are navigating that chooser's paradox, if you will, and some of that like really psychologically crushing social comparison, is by going back to like the comfort stuff and giving some of our agency over to, a charismatic leader, even if it's someone on social media who claims to have the answers and the cures to loneliness.
Which kind of leads me to, as history's shown, that political leaders often use language to create devotion, fear, even mass obedience. What are some historic examples of cultish rhetoric that you could see echoed in today's politics?
Oh my gosh. I mean, one example that really comes to mind, and I don't always find it productive or accurate to make comparisons between Jim Jones and certain political leaders who are at large right now, because Jim Jones is a unique person, and the Jonestown tragedy was, a unprecedented and since unreplicated event. However, one thing that Jim Jones certainly did that I find Trump doing is coining these really zingy, catchy nicknames for his adversaries that people latch onto because they are memorable and pithy and allow those on the inside to feel a sense of superiority. And some of these phrases are really clever, like, Jonestown, the People's Temple, started as more of a religious project, like an integrationist religious project that then really spiraled out of control to be more socio-political and then just abusive. But he coined this phrase like churchianity to describe a kind of Christianity that was just hung up on earthly bullshit and human politics. And that was, that really caught on, and people would use it to sort of lambast those who were not involved with the People's Temple, which was seen to be, this very self-actualized group of people. And, Trump has coined so many terms like that, whether he's talking about low energy Jeb or whatever. I mean, that's a really dated one, but
or fake news.
Totally. Yeah. And, I actually was just,
and that's kind of back to your us versus them language.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. And I mean, obviously Hitler had his own way of lambast. And again, I don't find it always productive to compare Hitler to Donald Trump. These are these sort of gut reactive things that people do, but to set the stakes, it is sometimes helpful to have those examples of, this fascistic leader also, otherized the media.
Or created an existential enemy.
Yes, that's right. And how are you supposed to create that enemy using any other tool than sort of populist language?
Yeah, exactly. So you've outlined 5 linguistic tactics that high control groups use, like thought terminating cliches, loyalty tests, rewriting history. Which do you think is the most dangerous and why?
Man, honestly, in today, I mean, I really think it's the thought terminating cliche. Like Robert J. Lifton in 61, he really knew. That was one prescient dude. I see it in comment sections all the time on Instagram when people are having really serious debates about things happening in the news or in politics. Sometimes I just see this totally mindless back and forth war of thought terminating cliches that they have been trained to say. And it doesn't even look like human beings having a conversation. And it's the same every time. It's just this battle of thought terminating cliches because they know that person said that argument, that triggers and cues me.
Yeah, they've seen it work.
This in response. And it's just this back and forth, and it can go but then it can go maybe 6 thought terminating cliches deep, and then everyone just disappears.
Yeah, then everyone's exhausted.
Yeah. Sorry? Okay, so I defined it earlier, but I'll define it again. It's sometimes known as a semantic stop sign, where it is this sort of super catchy stock phrase that you want to deliver to someone when they're expressing any kind of dissent to end the conversation. It's that sort of gotcha moment. So,
oh, great.
Yeah, it's meant to say you have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. I have access to the transcendent wisdom. And so I'm just gonna put your pushback to bed right here and there. And it's delivered so confidently that, and it's such a peculiar turn of phrase or such a familiar turn of phrase. Okay. So an everyday example would be well, everything happens for a reason. But an example that I've seen certainly recently in Instagram comment sections would be someone, delivering a certain argument politically and someone else saying, that's just whataboutism. Have you ever seen that? Someone will say
Whataboutism.
blah, 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 and someone will say, that's just whataboutism. And it's okay, what am I supposed to do with that? Yeah. Well, exactly. But it's the person has delivered it in such a sort of
emphatic
and smug way that there is literally nothing you can say. And in fact, sometimes saying something well, you're in a cult. That can be a thought terminating cliche. And it just sort of ends the conversation. It sometimes feels really good to end a conversation. So I get it. But once you start to recognize thought terminating cliches, you'll hear them everywhere.
Check your privilege.
Yeah, in certain contexts, for sure. I mean, there are ways to say that in a way that's less zingy and less smug, but communicating something real. I mean, let me think. No, there are ways of inviting someone to consider that like their lived experience is different from someone else's, and that like it might be time to have a conversation about how that might factor into the argument or the dialogue at hand. But to just smugly say your privilege, I think is a cue that like that person is like kind of done with the conversation. Yeah. So do your research. I've seen from some like QAnon types who believe that they have done research. They're not reading like yeah, and they've maybe research for them is like falling down a 4chan thread. It's not necessarily like reading peer review studies, but in certain communities like that, those types of studies have been really demonized, corrupted, that sort of as corrupted. So yeah, do your research is another one where it's like, oh, you haven't accessed the right sources, so I can't talk to you. Yeah.
So now that you've investigated this, how can you unsee cultish language?
I don't think I can really like unsee or unhear it, but that's so fun.
Yeah,
like,
that's true.
Because sometimes I've also come to realize that studying cultish language, I thought it would make me more like misanthropic and more like cynical, but it's actually just made me want to like figure out how to be cultier in what I would call on my podcast a live your life way.
Okay, so have you ever gotten caught up in a movement or a group yourself, drawn to its language?
Yeah, I mean, I was a theater kid. There's so much ritualistic language in the theater community, and it feels so good. And I remember as a high schooler, theater teachers, these are like just like people in suburban Baltimore, like directing a children's production of The Little Mermaid, who would say things to you like, if you have a fallback plan, you will fall back on it. Like, you need to commit to being a star.
Oh, wow.
I'm just like, yeah. So the theater community, 100%. I took that way too far.
Okay, so is there a phrase you think we should all stop using? Like it's overused, it's brinking on.
Oh, I don't know. No, I'm not in the business of like policing what people should and shouldn't say. I'm just in the business of inviting people to reconsider their own language a little more mindfully.
Okay, I like that. Since we're all here and, Frank and I have been trying to build a cult for, 25 years, are there any specific language that we should be using that we're not already?
For sure.
Or any language that you've seen that we're using that might be working?
Okay, I'm obsessed with, you're already turning a verb into a noun. Like, this is a happening. Like, loving that.
Okay, good.
That is so, yes, check, obsessed. I love that. I'm always thinking of like a new way to say like a get together or a gathering. It's happening. Like there's something really happening here. It's very active. Kudos on that.
Okay, good. Yeah, but whatever. Yeah.
That is so cult leader of you to like rebrand.
Oh, yeah. It's
an existing
derivative of something even cooler in the 60s, not?
Like practically L. Ron Hubbard already. Loving that for you.
He likes boats.
Yeah. I mean, look at this seafaring gorgeousness. Yeah, I would love to get on a boat with you all. Anywho, yeah, I mean, sure. Like continue.
Okay. Well, we're on the right track. Okay, good.
Yeah,
good.
Continue like deriving cool terminology from the 60s and 70s and repackaging it as your own.
Okay. And what's next for you?
Well, I'm writing fiction now.
Fun.
Yeah. I'm writing like speculative fiction, a story about a young, brilliant linguist cryptographer who uses her linguistic know-how to solve a potentially world-ending robot problem. It's a little bit, it's kind of inspired by Ted Chiang, if anyone here is a fan of Ted Chiang, his short story, Story of Your Life, which was the basis of the movie Arrival, if anyone's familiar.
One of our daughter's favorite movies.
That's one of my favorite movies too. So it's kind of a little bit inspired by that.
Language.
All about the language.
Hope you enjoyed the interview between Jessica and Amanda. I certainly did. As we're signing out, thinking about dinner.
Yeah.
What's on for tonight?
So I'm thinking, it's a Tuesday night special of sweet potatoes with miso butter and sauteed spinach, something a little healthy.
I like that. I'm looking at the, I've got CNN here. Wisconsin Supreme Court, 40% of the estimated vote is in. And Crawford has a lead. Let's hope it holds.
Yeah.
The future of Western civilization depends on it.
Oh, Orlando Bloom's on the TV. There's another story for another day.
Oh, man. No, that's not going on the pod.
Yeah, that was Hadid's house.
No, you can't
okay.
say that.
Anyway.
Nope.
He remembers.